Today, on the Future of Work webcast, we're going to have a conversation with Christopher Lind. And Christopher, I'll let you introduce yourself in just a second. And we are going to be talking about the future of work in the focus of our conversation today is going to be on continuous learning and learning technology. And I don't know, whatever else we decide to talk about today.
Whatever else comes up.
I wrote down a few questions, but we'll see where it goes, right? So, right on. All right. So, Christopher, I'll ask you to go ahead and introduce yourself because I'm sure you can do a much better job than I can.
And that's fine because I always feel awkward when people do introductions for me. It's just weird.
Right. All the accolades and
not even that. It's just weird hearing yourself be introduced in the third person. It's very strange. Yeah, and so for Christy and Becky, feel free to when we're going through this. I'm used to doing things virtually, so if you type stuff in the chat, I'll actually see it, and we'll respond to it as well. So this feels more like a dialogue than a presentation. But yeah, in terms of my background, it's an eclectic one to say the least. I started as a teacher, thought I was going to be a software engineer, got into teaching, hated academia, left teaching, didn't know where to go, went into corporate and found my way into corporate learning and development, and have since sat in pretty much every seat in an L&D function, whether it's LMS administration, facilitation, coordination, manager, director, VP, like it's kind of been all there. So have gotten a good feel for all the different capabilities and have always been focused on the technology piece, not for the sake of technology, but I think the thing that I find most fascinating about it is the number of rules that we've had in learning that are being shattered by technology. Well, we can't do this. You have to do it this way. And many of that was true 15, 20 years ago. There were a lot more limitations, and it was a factor of, well, that's kind of the limitations due to scale or resources or effectiveness that we have to do. And now most of those rules are being completely broken. So I guess that's my spiel.
I love it. And I think, so the focus of our conversation today, like I was saying, is really around the future of work and continuous learning. And the thing that I'm always fascinated about, Chris, is when we're thinking about how learning is impacting the speed of change and the rate with which we need to drive kind of organizational transformations. I'm curious about sort of what you think, how can we leverage learning technology to create more continuous learning or better continuous learning, right? And yeah, so let's start with that.
So I think that the challenge with that is I've always looked at learning as a tool that can better enable what's already there, or maybe, create more momentum or speed to something that already exists. Where I see it fall flat is when people throw technology at a problem, hoping that it's going to fix it, right? So if you don't have a culture of learning and a culture of development, and you say, well, we bought an LXP and filled it full of content from LinkedIn Learning, well, yeah, it's not going to do anything for you. And so I think a lot of the work that's happening right now is how do we address, and that's why you're seeing so much around culture and engagement, because the reality is you've got to tackle some of those things first so that people have an incentive to develop. They want to develop, they see incentive for doing that, so that you can then say, all right, well, now we're starting to build that culture of, and I honestly don't even like culture of learning personally. I think of it as more culture of curiosity and critical thinking. That's what we're driving to. We want people to be curious and to think critically about things, because when they do that, then they seek out solutions. They go find things. And that's where we can dive into, all right, well, then what tools can we use to better enable that? And so I think it's more about starting with the problem of what are you trying to do, and then we can backpedal into the technology. And you have to get some of this stuff working right. Now, that's not to say you have to have everything figured out before you start layering technology on, sometimes the technology is the right starting point, as long as well, we don't have this capability. We realize there's a tail to actually building that, and this technology is going to help us with it.
Interesting. So the starting point is what's the problem you're trying to solve, and then you leverage technology to fit the problem or to solve the problem. And as you're thinking about this notion of continuous learning, so I've heard that a lot, right? I mean, we hear that all the time when we talk about the future of work. When you think of continuous learning, putting your sort of uh, your
Yep.
information design or your instructional design hat on, what do you think about?
And so let me reframe the question just to make sure I'm understanding it. Like, how am I defining continuous learning? I guess, is that what you're
Yeah.
asking from an L&D
Yes.
standpoint? So going back to what that looks like, to me, I look at that as that is really that curiosity and critical thought, right? Continuous learning is well, first of all, it's the awareness that what you're doing today, you can't do for the next 20 years, right? It's that your job is changing, things are changing, you need to grow and develop, right? So some of it is first that awareness around that. And then where you're driving towards that afterwards is, okay, well, then how are you getting people to think about that? And you have to help them. The reality is you have to. And I think that's where some of these new technologies are really good at personalizing that, because a lot of people just get stuck. It's not that they don't want to grow and develop. Some don't, and that's fine. But a lot of people do. There's a little bit of analysis paralysis. They're just like, I don't know where to go or what to do or how to do that. And I think that's where, when you look at continuous learning, it's about creating that incentive, that motivation, and then creating the right level of guidance for people and the resources so that they can move it forward.
Interesting. So when you're thinking about leveraging technology to kind of help
Mhm.
with that, so one of the things I think about is, there's that old 70-20-10 rule of learning where 70% is experiential, right? All that
Uh-huh.
stuff. And I've heard so much about how technology can help us really drive that 70% more. So what do you think about that? So first of all, I'm curious, right? The 70-20-10, do you think that's got basis in reality? And then even if it doesn't entirely, how do we leverage technology to make it more experiential?
Yeah. So the 70-20-10, I always smirk when it comes up, because right, as a general framework, I agree with it, right? And the foundation that I agree with is, it's like, yeah, most stuff doesn't happen in a class. Like, that's not, formal learning isn't where most learning really happens fundamentally. So I joke about, part of the reason I kind of roll my eyes a little bit is the whole concept is based on a really bad study, and it just got blown out of proportion, and the thing grew teeth and hair, and it was like, oh no. So fundamentally, yes. Conceptually, as a general framework, yes, I agree that that's that. And I do think that's where not only is technology helping, but the role of L&D is changing to
Hmm.
better enable that, or it should be, because what, at least in my experience, I'm finding and have over the years is, we're better suited to, and we're going to get much more traction with the things that we do when we're partnering with the business and being more of an enabler to help them figure out, how do you do this for your business? How do you do this for your function? And helping them build that capability almost as a consultant, more than well, we're L&D, we're the owners, we know everything, and what we have is the be all end all. And that's where I think that's a mindset shift. That's just an operational shift in terms of how you're running L&D. And then where technology can help is, it's a lot of work to enable all these different teams and people. And that's where technology can help, because rather than having to do all that manually, you can kind of enable the team and say, hey, here's the tools that are going to help automate that. So you don't have to learn everything that we do in our area. We can kind of guide and support you through it.
Interesting. So one of the things I've heard a lot about is leveraging alternative um, augmented reality, alternative reality, to especially when we're thinking about helping people like learn trades or to learn sort of quote unquote soft skills. I kind of hate that term,
Mhm.
but so as you think about these sort of new, different ways of enhancing learning, how can we integrate those into our cultures to really help with those more uh, difficult types of learning, like
Yeah.
soft skills or leadership?
So going back to the earlier point, I think the biggest thing is, right, what problem are you trying to solve? And then that's when you can dive into some of these immersive techs. Because I've been in conversations where it's like, where can we use VR? Like, well, you're asking the wrong question. That's not the right question to be asking. But where I see this, and some of the things where just pragmatically it works very well is, in like you said, I think soft skills, the immersive nature of some of this stuff is good for practicing some of this, but not only just practicing. Because I've run an implementation, a large scale implementation on kind of a hybrid VR solution for, I call them human skills, for developing human skills.
I like that.
And at first, people were a little resistant because they said, well, why would we not just use people? Why wouldn't we just use our employees or consultants? Like, why would we use this weird technology where there's a person on the other end? And my response to that was, there's just enough in the term they use is suspended disbelief, where it puts people just in a phase where they become immersed and they almost kind of let go of some of the things that they have when they're interacting with, say, a peer. You think about role playing with a peer, there's the challenges that come with it. So I think some of those human skills are a key one. We can create environments that we wouldn't necessarily want to create with people. It may not be safe. It may not, I know some good friends who are in, training areas where you're training people to do stuff that like there's real risk associated with. You can't just say, hey, go drive this piece of heavy equipment with no training. Now in a VR scenario, you can say, well, if you crash, nothing's going to happen. So I think some of those things, really open up the opportunity. And just practically, AR to me is one that I think is going to really help move the needle in many ways, largely because I look at that as becoming the GPS for life. You really can layer on performance support versus traditional formal training. And rather than trying to get everybody to know how to do everything, we can say, well, let's enable them to just do, and let's give them the guidance along the way, because we know where they're located, we know what they're doing, we can see what they're doing, and we can help them through it. Getting back to the 70-20-10 thing, right? We can actually enable them when they're doing the work. Now, the risks or the challenges I think I see with some of these immersive technologies is similar to years ago when I was going through the whole challenge of, hey, we need to go mobile. We need to be able to reach people, and everybody still had flip phones. You're like, well, okay, people don't have smartphones yet. So, and I think some of these bigger immersive technologies, not everybody has an Oculus Rift and a supercomputer sitting at their desk. Not everybody has Google Glass or, implanted optics in their eyes. Like, we're not there yet. So I think those are some of just the technical challenges that we have with those.
Yeah, that's interesting. And it makes me think about, as we're kind of moving towards organizations that are faster and faster pace, right? So that notion of change just gets more and more rapid. What do you kind of see, even in your current experience, that is what we're really leveraging in terms of learning, either just sort of good learning practice or learning technology to help people with those skills that are getting out of date quicker and quicker?
Yeah. That goes back to what I was kind of referencing with the AR piece, and even whether you're going full blown AR or some of these other performance support type technologies, or even just take the technology out of it, kind of a more performance support. The reality is some of these skills, we have to start deconstructing what is the life cycle on some of this stuff, because the time it takes reskilling someone is very time intensive and very expensive. And so you have to really place your bets on, are these skills that we really need to reskill people on, or are these things that are going to be short lived that we can just give people the guidance and support to basically get to the finish line till this thing burns out, and then we can move on, because we can do that much faster and much more efficiently for things. We don't need everyone to, develop every single skill that may come, because it may be dead by the time you actually get around upskilling people in it.
So as the rate of change is increasing, are you seeing that there's going to be a blend of, we're going to support people through these sort of fast-paced changing technologies or processes, and teach them where we need to?
Yeah. So to give you, just to highlight an example of a project I recently did, right? We broke this down and we said, okay, this is where the human skills really came out. Some of these human skills we knew were going to stand the test of time. And we said, we really need to upskill, reskill, whatever buzzword you want to throw at it. We need to upskill this audience in this area, because the reality is it's not changing, right? That will always be a constant. It may change a little bit, but for the most part, we know the investment we're going to make in this is long standing. So we will upskill in that area. Where we said, look, we're not going to upskill in this, was around the very technical skills. So we don't need to teach people the whole formal learning, enable them to know how to do it on their own, because we have the technology to just help them get through it while they're doing it. I don't care if they remember it, or if they can do it on their own, because I don't need them to. We're just going to guide them through what we need them to execute, because we know by the time they would learn it, we won't even be doing it anymore. So that's where kind of that blend of formal learning and performance support are really starting to come together.
Interesting. And it sounds like, as a learning professional, we need to really understand the sort of, where is the business going in terms of both the sort of processes that they're using, but sort of what's the technology impact, all of those kinds of things. Do you feel like you're needing to get even more immersed in the sort of business of the business?
So I'll say for me personally, it hasn't really felt that different. I think again, my background may be a little more nuanced. I've always been in an operational function. So I've always been embedded in the business. So for me, the ops of everything is always just kind of my day to day. But I do think where there's this fine line is that we don't need to get better to the point where we need to be subject matter experts in the areas. At least I would advocate we don't. I think that's treading into dangerous territory, and we really don't know, right, what the business knows. But we do need to spend more time, to your point, getting to know the whys and the what's behind what's happening, so we can help use our skills, which is to deconstruct this stuff and say, well, I understand all these things are happening. What I'm seeing is this is a breakdown of these capabilities, these skills, these capabilities, and these skills. And then let's architect a solution that's going to best move us from point A to point B. But we don't need to become subject matter experts in the why, the what. I mean, you'll learn it along the way, but that's my take.
And so, as we're thinking about the future of how learning and learning technologies can support the business to be even more effective, where would you say organizations or individuals should start thinking about leaning in now?
Where individuals should start leaning into like their own skill set, or work wise, what are you thinking?
Yeah, I'm thinking more along the lines of skill set. So, if I'm a learning professional now, where should I be sort of spending my time to really kind of gain some expertise in?
So a couple things that I work with my teams on that I see as just a continued growth area, and I think we can all get better at it, is one, that front end, getting to what problem are we trying to solve, that's an art. I mean, actually being able to navigate those conversations as a L&D or talent professional, that doesn't happen overnight. And I think for a long time, we've gotten away with not necessarily having to do as much detective work on that end and really digging into, what is it we're trying to solve and why, and what are going to be the benefits, and how does that all work? Help me understand that. There's a very fine line and an artful way to do that so it doesn't come off as off-putting, right? Because you can really irritate people if you don't, because again, our industry or our function has kind of been known as order takers. And so if you just go from, yes, we used to just do everything you asked when you said, we just executed. And now all of a sudden you start saying, well, I need to understand this. Tell me more, justify to me the ROI of us doing this. You're going to make some real enemies real quick. So I think that skill set of how do you have that conversation to be seen as that strategic partner goes back to recognizing your role, your expertise. How do you navigate those conversations? So I think that's one area that I work heavily with my teams on continuing to develop. And to me, that's a long-standing skill. That's not something you're ever going to say technology replace that. If anything, that's only going to get more important. The other one that I spend a fair amount of time with is in understanding the capabilities of technology. So it's why I launched Learning Tech Talks. It's why I spend so much time connecting and collaborating with others. Is not that you have to become a technology expert. You don't have to become a technology expert and know how to code and all that good stuff, but you do need to understand system architecture and how capabilities work together. Because if you don't, you will be forever plagued with the Stockholm syndrome of, well, this is just how we have to do it. And it's like, no, that's not true anymore. And if you don't understand what those technological capabilities are, you're not going to be able to step out of your prison cell because you're going to think, I said it in a Forbes article, it's a paper mache brick wall that keeps us in, and you got to know what's on the other side and what's possible so you can break through. So that's the other one. And I think the other skill set that I've been working heavily with and encouraging teams on is really getting better at understanding. And I hate throwing the term like data and analytics, because that doesn't mean, that means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But that whole, when you start capturing on the front end, what problem are we trying to solve? And you do that really well. The need to understand how are we going to measure whether we did anything. And that doesn't mean we need to, get into the whole ROI discussion and prove every dollar spent on training results and blah, blah, blah. Not that. But if we go out and say, we're going to change, and as an example, right? I set out in one organization to say, we will get first pass approval on a submission, on a regulatory submission. And we're going to do that by improving the way we write these submissions. And I can, as an L&D person, construct a framework that will be able to measure that. That's the kind of stuff that I think is really important for us to think about is, okay, so if we make those commitments, what are the levers? What are the behavioral leading measures? Confidence, capability, like what are those things, and how are we going to track and measure that so we can tell that story? So that's my take.
Yeah, that's interesting. So that, right, consulting skills, understanding the sort of the technology at a, not at the, down at the deepest level, but sort of limitations, and then really understanding how are we going to measure success. Yep. Yeah. So I want to double down on a couple of those just for a moment. So as we think about the capabilities of the technology, oftentimes I find in organizations there are decisions that are kind of already made, right? You're using this, right? We paid $1 million, but this is what we're using. So how can L&D professionals or just business professionals really be able to understand how to get the most out of that system that they're using?
Yeah. And this goes back to an important part when it comes to these technology discussions. Sometimes you don't need a new tool, right? I've seen many conversations where they just weren't utilizing the capabilities of the tools they had. And the thought was, well, if we go buy the new, right, we go buy the new car, we'll fix the price. Like, well, no. So I, that goes back to that whole understanding how technology works, right? You have to understand relatively deeply, like what can be done with some of these systems, and when, can we actually get more out of something that we may already have. That said, part of the reason that I spend a lot of time doing that is it helps me build the business case for why what we have isn't good enough, right? Because as an example, I was with One Oregon, we had an LMS, right? We had an LMS. We're not going to get some other tool. We already have an LMS. And so as I started deconstructing what the activities that we were doing and the way users were using things, I was able to paint that picture of, yes, we have an LMS, but this is what we're trying to do. And all these things can't be done, or these are the very inefficient workarounds that we're doing to accomplish it. And by switching or augmenting it with something else, these are all the benefits that we're going to get out of it. And so instead of saying, well, we're going to replace the LMS, it led to, right, an augmentation with another tool. But it actually helped with some of that, so that, because I can tell you right now, if you have an LMS and you just go to your leaders and say, we need a different LMS, it's not going to go very well. I mean, maybe
Right.
it would for some people, but in my experience, it does not go very well.
Interesting. Yeah. And so really understanding deeply that technology, and its opportunities and limitations is very, very powerful. The other thing that I wanted to double down on was this measurement, right? So
Mm-hmm.
one of the things that I hear a lot is that we need to really ensure that we're connecting the work that we're doing with driving business results, or organizational results. And so, are you thinking that you really want to be able to pinpoint how whatever it is that you've put together, does that actually solve the problem that we were trying to solve?
Yes. And
And
there's a lot more to it from that standpoint, at least the way I approach it. So, do I care? And I have to be careful how I frame this because it can come out completely wrong. Do I care if the initiative that I lead or my teams lead has an impact on revenue? Honestly, sometimes I'm like, I'm curious, but realistically, there are so many other variables that are playing into that. I don't really care. I do, but it's more of a curiosity. Where I do really care, and this goes back to really honing in that art of measurement, is on the front end when we identify what the problem is. I spend an inordinate amount of time deconstructing what the behaviors or what the problems really look like. So we can start to identify, well, where is it breaking down? So if people aren't doing this stuff, like why? What should they be doing that they're not? What are the things that are getting in their way? Those types of things. What information do they not have easy access to? So that when we go to the measurement piece, I'm measuring what I believe to be lead measures to those lag measures of revenue, operational
right,
efficiency. Like, fine. But that's a partnership between the business and I to say, well, we both agree on these. I can't know what actually drives your business. So you have to tell me. I'll work with you. I'll extract that from you. But you have to help me understand, is it, what's going on? I can construct a solution that will make people better at that. Whether they choose to execute against that or not,
right.
I can help. I can try and enable, I can give you good change management or implementation solutions, but ultimately you're accountable for whether they actually put that into play. So I had an initiative a couple years back where the whole initiative proved that the business's prediction of what was going wrong was wrong. And I was fine with it. I mean, the project on paper was a complete failure. We spent all this money and time doing this, and it turned out, well, we did all that. We know everybody can do it, and we still have the problem, which helped us actually get to the right solution.
Yeah.
So it really wasn't a failure in my book.
Yeah, I think that's actually really powerful. I know a couple folks that are working on sales training, right? So they're developing training for sales organizations. And I think the thing that's so interesting is they're kind of doing the same thing, right? They're deconstructing all the pieces, parts of the sales process, and then identifying where can learning really impact a part of that process, and then measuring, does it happen, and does it help? And then there's other steps they need to take to get to the
Yep.
sale, but that's a really powerful way, even for the business, to understand, well, what is it that my people are spending time on, and where else could we automate, right? The dialers, or proposal
Exactly.
writers, or whatever. Um,
Yep.
yeah, that's really interesting, and it kind of makes me think of this whole uh, phrase that I'm actually really interested in, this whole notion of digital transformation, and I use air quotes mostly because I feel like it's a it's a thing that's happened a lot previously. Uh,
Right.
and as we're thinking about digital transformation, um, so what role do you feel that learning plays as organizations are needing to really hone their processes and connect more to technology, and really be able to leverage automation in a powerful way?
So I guess I look at the role that I play and our org plays as we're almost like behavioral scientists, right? I mean, that's really what we're trying to do, is to say what's going on in the because organizations run on people. And so our job is to say, all right, well, let's diagnose this. Let's figure out what's going on with the people. And from a digital transformation standpoint, let's figure out, okay, well, if this is what's going on with the people, what part of that component, maybe the problem is people shouldn't be doing it. It's not a good use of their time. If they should be doing it, why are they not doing it? And really kind of building that forward. So I think, digital transformation is more of a mindset than a buying the right platform or, automating the right processes. It's about really having a focus on, let's get people spending the majority of their time doing the things that engage them and make them, right, really puts them to the best of their use. And let's get the other crap out of the way so we can run more efficiently as a business. That's kind of how I look at it. And that's why I think our role is so critical in digital transformation, because in my opinion, we're some of the best people equipped to help come up with the right plan to make that stick. Because if it doesn't stick with the people, you're going to have problems.
Yeah, yeah, and I think we've seen that, right, in when organizations were implementing SAP and PeopleSoft and things like that, right? They were trying to automate these processes and didn't do a good job, like you were saying, and really making sure that it connected with people. And so
Right.
people had workarounds, right? They kind of kept their own spreadsheets, or wrote things down on a piece of paper, or sent emails, or whatever it was.
Right.
So, just a couple last questions.
Yeah.
So, I'm curious, as you are thinking about, what's the kind of key critical thing that someone who's leveraging learning technology, what's the thing that they need to be worried about in the near future, if anything?
Oh, I think, oh man, that's a good question. I have no hair. So like there's no shortage of things to worry about. I'll tell you that. Um, I think one of the biggest challenges, and not necessarily to worry about, is man, you're making me distill it to one. So fundamentally, I think this is one of the biggest ones. Not only do we need to understand what this technology is, but we've got organizations filled with people who don't understand what technology is capable of or how it really impacts people. And so there is a lot of risk associated with decisions being made or technology being implemented or used in a way that opens up the organization to tremendous risk, or just, right, not just risk like, oh, you're going to get sued, but risk of you might make a decision that completely disengages your entire workforce. And so I think some of those things are, as organizations are being forced to make more and more decisions around technology and how are we using it and what are we doing with it to drive us forward, it can be overwhelming to some degree. So how do we stay focused on the important ones and really put ourselves out there to do what we can to help drive it in the right direction? So I think that's part of it. I think the other thing from a just purely learning technology standpoint, there is so much stuff out there and more stuff's coming out every day, and just trying to stay on top of it and understand, hey, what's worth it, what sticks, what's right for our organization, what's not, that that can be overwhelming for even the most skilled learning technologist or whatever. So I think it's about, really making sure you're not working in a vacuum, because if you are, you're gonna get lit up, man. You're gonna get lit up. So I think that's where more than ever having that network and connecting and understanding what others are doing and pulling people in and being okay to say, I need help. Like I don't know what to do. I do it all the time. There are plenty of times where I'm like, I have no idea how to tackle this situation. And the only way I'm going to get around it is by talking to other people who can bring another perspective or maybe have approached it differently. So
Yeah, that's awesome. Like that whole notion of unintended consequences, right? So you bring in a technology and what what could happen that you didn't even think about. I think that's really powerful. And then really making sure that you're not being a victim of the paradox of choice, right? That kind of there's so much stuff out there that how do we make the right choice and not being sort of myopic in, right, that I've got to make the choice. Maybe there's other people that can help me figure it out, and give me better advice. That's
yeah.
awesome.
Well, in the first one, the one thing I would add to that first one, especially as you start talking about these more immersive technologies or technologies that are capturing more data, I mean, there's a fair amount of ethics
Mm,
involved in what are we doing with this? How are we using this information? Because there's a lack of trust, I think, with a lot of people on, well, okay, you're capturing all this data on me, like what are you doing with it? And yeah, there's the regulation side of it, but there's just even the internal culture standpoint of, people are nervous, and you start digging into these technologies that start capturing more on your personality, your leadership, like your ability to make decisions. What are you actually doing, right? AR is cool, but now having a device on you that knows where you are and what you're doing at all times, like people are like, well, what are you doing with that? And so we have to be really careful that we think of, right, the potential long-term consequences of not making the right decisions in the short term.
yeah. Wow, that's really interesting. I guess I hadn't even really thought about sort of that whole uh, ethics and capturing personal data. That is a challenge, right? That's a challenge for us everywhere. I mean, we think about what's going on with Facebook and all those organizations, and how people are really starting to question, like, what are they doing with all that information, and why are they commoditizing me and my face, right?
Right.
And so we don't want to do that in our own organizations, or we want to minimize the impact of that's great insight. So last question, flip side of what we were
Yeah.
just talking about, where do you see the biggest opportunities for organizations to really leverage learning technology?
Hmm. Some of them honestly are really, really, really simple. Like some of the biggest innovations that I've led or been involved with were not that complicated. Some of the simplest ones were even like what we're doing right now. I mean, we've talked multiple times. We've never met, but I feel like if I bumped into you like at the grocery store, we'd have a conversation because we've built that relationship. And the power of some of these simple technologies in enabling organizations to realize that, really fundamentally you can achieve so many of the things that you didn't think were possible through simple means,
Hmm.
is huge. Now, so I think that's right at the basic level. Simple things like we can bring people together globally on a frequent basis and connect and collaborate in ways never possible. And from an effectiveness standpoint, I still have challenged people, prove to me, right, quantifiably that you can see a performance impact difference between these two if you do it right. So I think some of those are there. I think personalization is a huge opportunity for technology to help things. We have been limited by the peanut butter spread approach of L&D in many regards because we've had to. I mean, I know how much I have been the person responsible for trying to cut a data set and be like, well, these people need this and these people need this. And you're still peanut butter spreading it. You're just being like, well, by job title, we assume that these people have these development needs. Technology is getting so much better at helping us identify really where are people's gaps at an individual level and what do they need to move forward so that you truly can give people what they need instead of giving people everything and hoping they figure it out. That to me is exciting.
Yeah. Wow, that's really interesting. That notion that each person definitely is unique, and that we have the opportunity to sort of build learning plans or learning opportunities that can fill the gaps for each person in a different way.
Right. And I think it can help people reach potentials that they maybe didn't realize before. You know, maybe they thought, and I've seen firsthand this happen where people were in a role, they thought this is my only option. And technology has allowed them to see, hey, I have these capabilities. I'm good in these areas. That actually makes me really potentially good at being over in this area. And they make the move and go, holy cow, I would have never found this had I not realized, right, that this path wasn't a universal point A to point B, but really it was a matrix. So,
Hmm. Yeah. And that's interesting too, because in our organizations, right, we're that notion of the ladder, right, is really kind of going away. And we have to think much more about sort of our career lattice, right? That idea of kind of moving up and around. And it's interesting, and it makes a lot of sense that learning technology can really help you explore what's possible, and then maybe gain the skills that you need to fill in the gaps to be able to be ready for a different role in a
yes.
different part of the organization.
Yep. Now, granted, this is where there's always the like, and organizationally, your organization has to be open, right? It
Yeah.
has to have a culture of thinking about it that way. Because if your organization has a culture of, well, we still require 10 years of, blah, 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 that's based on really nothing other than just that's how we've done it, you could have extremely capable and talented people in a different area that would be ideal for this stuff. But if your org is still kind of running in that mindset, your technology is limited, and what you may be doing is equipping your people to be awesome somewhere else.
Yeah, well, I mean that's the risk, right? And it sort of takes the conversation full circle, where we're thinking about what you got to solve. You got to think about what the problem is you're trying to solve, and then you also have to make sure that your organization's culture is ready for whatever it is that you're implementing,
Yeah.
because if you don't do that, the technology either could be sitting on the shelf, technically, theoretically speaking, or it could be, like you're saying, sort of misused, right, to train your competitors'
Yeah.
best employees.
Well, and it's a very important point to consider, is you really have to assess that goes back to the needs assessment side of things. You have to assess where an organization's at. You can go out and buy the coolest, fanciest new technology, but if culturally you've still been doing, 3-day workshops and that's the only thing you've done for the last 100 years, an LXP is not going to suddenly make things different. So,
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I think we have one question here from Becky, and she's asking, what advice do you have on how to adjust the learning strategy to be able to use or adopt modern learning or digital learning? How can they best transition to the curiosity culture that you mentioned? That's a great question.
yeah, good question. I knew you were going to throw me a good one, Becky. So I'll give my perspective on this. The slow walk and meeting people where they are, to me, has always worked well. And do those baby steps, right? The coming in and jumping from, I actually learned that the hard way a couple times, right? Because I was always, right, thinking of the most modern cutting edge stuff. And I walked into a few orgs and was like, we're going to do this. And it just blew up. But what I had to do is create that roadmap of, hey, here's where we're going. Here's how. And I think this goes back to the transition to the curiosity culture, and at the same time help people adopt the modern learning strategy. You got to live it. Like,
Mm,
you've got to live it. If you don't believe it, people just sense it. And so, like, for me, I'll give the example of when I first joined GE. I came in and I was rearing to do, modern cool stuff, and the org just wasn't ready for it yet. But to get them there, I had to do it. I had to breathe it. I had to live it. So, as an example, right, I was the guy, the nutsy guy, always on webcam. I was the one running virtual meetings in a way that people weren't familiar with. So they started to see and believe that, hey, this could be done differently. This could be done better. And, then I started enabling other people to do it. And we really kind of created a trend that changed the org. I mean, sometimes I look back and go, I can't believe it now. But I think it really starts it's kind of a cliche, but you have to be the change you want to see. And if you can't do that, you'll always struggle with moving others forward. So I think that's been my experience with it. And again, I've tried a number of different things. Some worked, some haven't, and it really has depended on the org. But I think the other thing, getting to that curiosity that I do think universally we can get better at, we have to get much better at storytelling
mm,
and telling the story of what's possible. And people are freaking out. They're hearing reskill, they're hearing automation, they're terrified. And when fear kicks in, people don't want to change. That curiosity, just people go into that closed mode. And if we can get better at telling the story of why are we doing this? What does that future look like for you? Help paint that picture. You're still going to get your people who aren't going to do it, but you can accept that because more people will be open to it. So I guess that's my 2 cents.
yeah, that's super powerful. Becky, does that address the
Hopefully that
question that
answers
you
your
were?
question, Becky.
I hope it does. Oh, yep, looks like it does. Thank you. Uh,
Smiley face.
yes, right? The ubiquitous smiley face. It's interesting too, because it's that whole notion of, are we, with storytelling, right? Are we kind of creating the folklore where people are expecting, the Terminator and Hal, or are we creating folklore where people are expecting, the Jetsons and all that great stuff that helps us, right, kind of do the things and be the kind of people that we want to be. So
Yeah.
it's a very powerful way to think about it.
Well, I know, right? So from the storytelling standpoint, one of the greatest, well, I've had a couple that have gone really well, and it was all around crafting a powerful story, an emotional story around, the latest one was Learning Reimagined. And it wasn't about future state, you're going to have Google Glass, but it was about reimagining the possibilities of what development looked like and how we were going to change the world by helping you know, feel, and do things differently. And it was a powerful story, and people globbed onto that as that it got them excited. And yeah, you still had your naysayers, but again, it really helped solidify what it was and crafted the vision that we were shooting for so that people could get behind it.
Awesome. Wow. That's really great. Well, I guess I'm going to put a pin in it for right now, just because I feel like that's a really good place to end the conversation. And I just love that notion of, we want to make sure that we're leveraging technology, but we got to get people, right, kind of embracing the technology and embracing the why behind the technology. Because I think that there's just an inherent mistrust of, what are we doing? Why are we doing this? What is this leading to? Right. So
The
I think
flavor
it's,
of the week, like it's going to be gone tomorrow. Yep.
yeah. And I think the other thing is that people are just really concerned about, what does that mean for my future? And am I going to be the wagon wheel builder of the future, right? Where what I'm doing doesn't matter. And right, I think the thing that you're pointing to is that, no, right? We don't want you to be that, right? We want you to be the person that's enabling us to be more successful in the future. So,
Yep.
yeah. Awesome. So our guest today has been Christopher Lind. Thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it here on the Future of Work webcast for ChangeNerd. And I'm excited that you guys were here. Awesome conversation, and awesome that you joined us. So look for this recording to be out in just a little while. And again, Christopher, thanks a lot for your time. As always, awesome conversation.
Oh, always a pleasure. Always enjoy our conversations.
Thanks a lot.